This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jayson Blair, and this is a bonus episode from the True Crime Meetup we had in Minneapolis this month. This episode is with retired FBI Profiler Julia Cowley of the Consult podcast. In this bonus, we discuss a few interesting topics, including clues about the UnitedHealth CEO shooter, the warning signs of intimate partner abuse and domestic violence, and a variety of other cool topics about profiling and more. At the event in Minneapolis, we had podcasters from all over participate, including Brandon Hall of Music City 911, Dana Pohl of True Crime PI and Seeking Justice, Lexi Kakas of Seeking Justice as well. We also had guests like Julia, Jim Schmidt, an advocate for domestic violence prevention and missing and murdered people who don't get the same attention as his daughter, Gabby Petito. Monty Frank was another one of our guests. Monty is the father of Nada Frank, a Minnesota woman from the Leech Lake Band of the Ojibwe, who went missing several times and was eventually murdered. We were also joined by David Middleman, the head and founder of Othram Labs, which has revolutionized the use of DNA in forensic science. Special thanks go out to Raul Montero, who is known online as Catch Lisk and is an advocate for identifying the unidentified and missing persons. And Robert Palmer, the host of the Broken System podcast. Robert and Raul helped me organize the event. If you'd like to access more of our conversations with many of these folks, hop over on to our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Lining Handbook. With that, enjoy this conversation. So, everybody, I want to introduce you to one of my favorite podcasters, also one of my favorite people because we've become friends over the years, Julia Cowley, a retired FBI profiler. Since you guys are true crime fans, you should know, if you go to Julia's Twitter, it says that she got into this because of true crime and is not ashamed of it. Julia, actually, I'll ask her a little bit about her background, but she actually entered law enforcement through the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, where she was a forensic scientist. So that's her background. She eventually started working in the Boston Field Division or Boston Division of the FBI, did everything from investigating white collar and civil rights cases to working in evidence response. Julia will tell you that when she asked initially, what are the chances of getting into the behavioral analysis unit? She was told that the chances were about 0, and she knew mathematically that had to be inaccurate.
So, I'm smart.
Right. So it led to her work today. And The Consult is kind of an amazing podcast for those of you guys who have not had the opportunity to listen to it. It really looks at crime from a behavioral perspective, sort of the things that you can tell, and I'll ask about it, about human behavior that help you identify the type of person, or even in some cases, despite what she'll say, the person who may have committed a crime. And I think, Julia covers a lot of the cases that some of my other favorite podcasters do. It adds an element and dimension that really helps you get a good idea, not just from the perspective of who the likely perpetrator would be, but behaviors and actions that can tell us a lot about people. So I think it can help for advocacy and prevention and an assortment of other things, perhaps unintentionally. So Julia, thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. I wanted to have the opportunity, and Julia's been on my podcast. She and one other podcaster are in a competition, actually 3 podcasters now for the most times back. But I wanted to ask you just a little bit about how you ended up working in law enforcement, and your journey to the BAU.
Well, as you mentioned already, it was I don't like to use the word love of true crime because, obviously I don't love what other people do to victims, but certainly my interest in true crime, which I got from my mother, who read a lot of true crime. She followed true crime cases. She watched court TV, all of that. I remember her early days watching hearings on television, and I became fascinated. All I wanted to do was read true crime books. I'd go to the bookstore. I'd sit in front of the very small true crime section. I think I read every single book there. And I knew it somehow I wanted to get into law enforcement, help solve murders, something along the investigative pathway. And I didn't necessarily want to be a police officer. But then I read about this science called police science, which ultimately was described as we know as forensic science. And I thought, well, that's what I want to do. I'd love to work in a crime lab and go to crime scenes and process the scenes. And so that's how I got started. I directed my education in that way. I majored in chemistry. I got a master's in forensic science. As you mentioned, I worked for the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation as a forensic scientist. It was a great job, great opportunity. I learned a lot, went to a lot of crime scenes, processed those scenes. And then I became interested in the FBI, not only from, again, other true crime books that I had read, but I also had a colleague that I admired greatly who entered the FBI a couple of years before I made my decision, and he encouraged me to apply. So that was my journey to the FBI, my early journey to the FBI.
And what, from your perspective, coming into the FBI, going to the academy, and starting your training, did you know you wanted to do something like behavioral analysis, or were you just thinking something similar to what you were doing in Tennessee?
No, I wanted to do behavioral analysis. I wanted to be a profiler, so to speak. And I knew that I didn't want to give up my forensic background. And I knew that there was the opportunity to be a part of the FBI's evidence response team, which I was for many years. And so I did that alongside my investigative role. As you mentioned, I worked white collar, public corruption, civil rights. That was my investigative background, but I also had the forensic background by being on the evidence response team. But I knew entering the FBI that I wanted to be a profiler. And like you said, when I was in graduate school, there was an FBI agent that came and spoke to some of the students. And it wasn't me who asked the question. It was another student who asked, what are the chances of becoming a profiler? And I think by this point, Thomas Harris's book had come out and The Silence of the Lambs had already come out. So there was a lot of people who were interested in becoming profilers because of those books and movies. And the FBI agent said, your chances are zero. And I thought, well, that's not possible. It can't be zero. I have a little bit of math in my background there. So
something.
Well, it was discouraging. It was a way, I think it was a way that he was trying to tell us, if you think you're going to join the FBI to become a profiler, you're going to be disappointed because it's not a job that everybody has an opportunity to do. And so when I joined the FBI, I knew that I might not get that opportunity. And so I joined knowing that and knowing, okay, I'm going to be happy with what other opportunities I might have, whatever were to come my way, but I'm still going to try to become a profiler. So that's what when I joined, that was my mindset. Like, I may not get that opportunity, but I'm going to do everything possible to, at least try.
So I'm going to ask you about a case that, comes out of this area in a second. But I wanted to, since you brought up the movies like Silence of the Lambs, and I actually this week it's very funny. So when I want to like comfort myself with TV, I watch Criminal Minds, which I find mildly weird, but a because it doesn't feel real. But I wanted to ask, how accurate are those things like Mindhunter and Silence of the Lambs? Are there some sort of accuracies in them?
Not really. I mean, say some of it is. I mean, it's based on you have, former profilers that contributed to the making of those movies and the TV shows, and some former profilers even write for the TV shows. So there's some accuracy to them. I think the main difference is just the level of excitement. Now, first of all, it was a wonderful job. I loved it, but it's portrayed very different in the movies and in TV, unless it's a, real book on the subject. But, we're not, I think the biggest misconception is that as a profiler, you're not investigating the crime anymore. You are consulting with the investigators. It's their case. It remains their case. And so we don't take over the case. We don't come in and swoop in and make arrests and interrogate the suspects. We don't do any of that, but we advise on those things. And so when you go from being a regular FBI agent, as I did, to becoming a profiler, you become a lot less active. You're just not as operational, so to speak, as you used to be, because you're just reviewing someone else's investigation. And I don't want to say just, because there's a lot of work that goes into it, but you're just not doing the active investigation anymore. And I think that's the biggest misconception you see on TV versus what the real life of an FBI profiler is like.
And I was going to ask you about the local case. One case that I wasn't that familiar with that you did on the consult, and it was an introduction, and it was Jody Husenart's case. Would you mind talking to us a little bit about that case and what how you eventually, or how you were able to sort of pull it together and why you chose that for the consult?
Oh, you mean are you talking about Jody Husentrut?
Yes, Husentrut.
Yes.
Yep.
So that was not a case that we had originally looked at when we were part of the BAU. Jody's case, and as maybe some of the people listening may or may not know, Jody was a news anchor in Mason City, Iowa, and she was abducted on the early morning hours of June 27th of 1996. Wait, I'm sorry, I'm getting the date, 1997. And that case was brought to us by Caroline Lowe, who was a retired crime reporter in the area. She started reporting on Jody's case, I believe. I may not have this entirely accurate, but it was a couple years after she disappeared, and she started reporting on the case and remains committed. And there's a group of journalists that have gotten together. They formed a group called findjody.com, and they continue to report on the case and keep Jody's case in the spotlight. So Caroline Lowe had approached us and asked us if we would take a look at the case and discuss the behavior that we see in the case. And it's a way, again, to help highlight the case, to help put it back in the spotlight, and then hoping that maybe somebody will hear something and recognize something and call in that one tip that's needed to help solve the case and find out what happened to Jody and to bring her home to her family.
So we have at least one of those journalists in the room over there, Brian. So I'm sure you'll have some questions at some point. But I'm curious. So when you guys were working on it, and my understanding is that the consult podcast itself really mimics what you all, a accurate mimicking of what you all would do. What is the process for you, and what was the process in Jody's case? If you could give a little background on what had happened, what was the process, and what kind of conclusions did you guys come to?
Well, the process is, and as you mentioned, it is very much like what it's like to sit in the room when we're doing a consult on the BAU or in the BAU. The show is not scripted. We discuss things, we debate things, we may circle back to topics we thought we already exhausted. But our process is to look at the crime scene, try to understand as best we can what happened, what the interaction was between the offender and the victim, what evidence is available, what can we rely upon as reliable evidence, reliable witness statements, reliable timelines. What can we count on to be accurate? The other thing that's an important part of our analysis is victimology and looking at a victim, a crime victim, in a very thorough way. And it does involve looking at very sensitive areas. And so the point of asking these questions is not to blame the victim, but it's to understand the victim, what might have put them at risk, what were risk mitigators, what were risk enhancers, how would they likely react if confronted by a violent offender, all these things. So that's what we did in this case with the help of Caroline Lowe, who's very familiar with the details. And just based on the reporting of findjody.com, we find them to be very reliable. They're not sensational. We like the way they report things and evaluate things. And so we felt like, talking with Caroline, we get the most accurate description of what happened. We also looked very heavily at Jody's victimology. And ultimately, we felt that, her status as, a local celebrity and local news anchor, probably, yeah, she was a news anchor. She's very popular. And we felt like that put her at the greatest risk in her personal life. And the lack of security, back then, it was very different. Her home address was in the local phone book. She would easily be found if somebody wanted to do her harm. So some of these things really made us think that was probably where her risk came from. Now, there was somebody in her life, an older gentleman friend that people had thought to be, potentially responsible. And we really felt that after looking at who he was, the relationship that he had with Jody, and not only that, Jody herself, she was an extremely genuine person. I think that was the one thing that we heard across the board. She was not a phony in any way, shape, or form. What you saw is what you got with Jody. So we didn't feel that Jody would keep someone in her life that posed a risk to her or made her uncomfortable. That's just not who she was. She was a very strong, independent woman. And despite the fact that she was so kind and friendly and genuine, she was smart and independent and was doing things that were right for her. And so we didn't feel she'd keep this person in her life if he made her uncomfortable. So we just felt that he should be deprioritized as a main suspect and maybe start considering some other aspect or some other people that could have posed her harm. And she had reported months before her disappearance, I should say abduction, that she was being followed. And she had some concerns, some safety concerns. And so there were some things going on that might have been indicators that she was in danger by somebody. Now, we can't say for certain that those were related, but we thought they were significant.
One of the things that I thought in listening to your episodes on that case that was really interesting, I think you guys sort of, in my mind, it kind of, starts with, or it doesn't have to start, it starts with a crime scene, victimology, and almost like a triangle. It points to a perpetrator. What was it about the crime scene in Jody's case that stuck out to you?
Well, what stuck out to us is that the offender didn't try to talk to her. There was the intention was to go there to do her harm, to grab her, take her away. There was no indication that this person wanted to talk with her. There was no indication of an escalation of violence. And so there was a plan in place already. And we felt if this was somebody more in her personal life, they likely would have tried to talk to her. Maybe there would have been an escalation of violence, but that's not what you see. You see somebody who went there and it was a blitz attack and they had no intention of having any kind of conversation with her. So I think that's what really stuck out about what we saw at the crime scene. It happened very quickly.
And so that because there was an escalation and what you knew about her, it sort of pointed you toward the idea of a stranger or someone who was stalking her.
More so, yes. I think that is what we tended to take from that. We felt if this was somebody in her personal life, that there, first of all, would have been other indications of problems, that there would have been reports that Jody would have told her friends and family, this person is making me uncomfortable. I don't like this. We had a fight. There was just nothing like that. There was nothing indicating that there was any kind of problem with anyone that was part of her social circle, so to speak. So we just felt like this is somebody who, whatever they decided, they weren't going to talk to her. They weren't going to reason with her. They were going to take her. And that was the plan.
So one of the things I'm consistently hearing about the consult when I look on social media and also listen to my fans is that, and so you may not be able to answer this question, but is unique among true crime podcasts. So I wanted to ask what you and Bob Drew and Susan Koffler Drew and Angela, what your thought in starting a podcast really was and what you were trying to bring to the space.
Well, I don't know that we thought a lot about how we were going to do a podcast. I think we just thought we want to talk about some of the cases that we've worked on, some of the behavior. We wanted to educate people about what criminal profiling was and was not. It's, as you point out, there's some great shows, great TV and movies out there that are really fun and exciting. But I think we wanted to educate people about the concepts of behavioral analysis, and then maybe even a way to make people more aware of their surroundings and more aware of problematic behavior, warning signs, things like not to scare anybody, but just to make people have a better understanding. It really, we just wanted to do that through talking about the behavior that we see in these cases. Now, it's evolved. It's certainly evolved. There are certain things when we first started out we didn't necessarily think about, but has now, been part of our mission of the podcast. For example, highlighting lesser known cases. That was not something we necessarily thought we were going to do when we started out. We were just going to start talking about some of the cases that we thought had some really interesting behavioral aspects to them. But as we've become more popular and people reach out to us, or some of the cases that we see that we've worked on that remain unsolved, to continue to highlight those and bring those to the attention of people who might not have otherwise heard about them.
One of the neat things I find about profilers is you guys can provide everything from investigative support, interview questions, recommendations on juror selection. There's just a wide variety of things you could do. And there are two cases. I know you were the lead profiler on the Golden State Killer case. And I know that Bob worked on Israel Keys and some of you. Would you mind talking a little bit about the different kinds of things that you guys, and then there's also the Walika murders, talking about different things that profilers contributed to those cases?
Well, sure. So I'll start with the Israel Keys case, because that was a very unique case for us, because we looked at the two different crimes that we know for sure Israel Keys committed, but we did not know it at the time. So we looked at the Courier case, Bill and Lorraine Courier, who went missing in Essex, Vermont. And we did a profile of that case. And it was just, it was early on. It was the early stages of the investigation. It was a very unusual case and very low risk victims who just disappeared from their home. So we provided a lot of, insight about what we thought happened. And then, fast forward almost a year later, and then you have the abduction of Samantha Koenig in Anchorage, Alaska. And we were also involved in that case very early on when she disappeared. And then the offender, the person who was unknown at the time, started communicating with the family and trying to get a ransom from them. And so we were consulting on that. No idea that they were related. And then we find out, once Israel Keys is arrested, he confesses to Bill and Lorraine. And so that was our involvement there, providing guidance, providing behavioral insight to what we were seeing in these two different cases. And then, of course, once we know that it's by the same offender, at that point, trying to understand who is this guy and what else might he have done and what else might be out there that we don't know about. In the Golden State Killer, again, that was just providing offender characteristics about the offender and providing some investigative suggestions as well. And of course, that was a long time ago that we consulted on that case. And so even then, even though I think it was 2011, maybe around that time, we certainly didn't see how that, the future of how that was going to be solved. I mean, I always knew technology would solve it, but of course, we really were not familiar at the time with investigative genetic genealogy. So that's what we did with that case. And then, of course, Walika, again, providing unknown offender characteristics. That was a double murder of 2 girls in Walika, Oklahoma. And then not only that, we provided interview strategy once they identified a suspect.
Ask you how accurate the profiles were on Golden State or Walika. Do you feel like, looking back, like we were pretty close, or?
I do.
Off?
Yeah, I think we were very close on both of them. One of the things we also try to let people know about profiling, you're never going to be 100% right. And there's going to be things that you slightly miss on. Like, for example, not that my age range was wrong. I actually found out, no, my age range was right. But I personally thought Joe D'Angelo would be younger than he was. So that was just my own personal. So I was very surprised that he was as old as he was. I was putting him to be a little younger, but I did have him within that range. I was in the right range, but I still was very surprised by that. But generally, when people are arrested and we've gone through, when you can really look at and have access to all the information, crime scene photos, autopsies, initial police reports, just the looking at the very basics of that crime, but having access to those basics, generally we can be pretty accurate. You might miss on a few minor things, but we pretty much have a sense of who that person is. We may not be able to identify them, but we understand them and their personality traits and characteristics.
I was talking to some of the people who are here with us in Minneapolis about a very sad case that they were sharing, and it made me think of something, that so many of the cases that any of us in this space get involved in are very dark and sad, and you guys are dealing with some, I think to some extent, some offenders where it's a lot harder to figure out who they are, but many of them have done really dark, horrible things. And I was just going to ask, like, how do people in the BAU manage the emotional side of, I'm like curious, does the FBI check in on you guys, or do they, do you guys take breaks or sabbaticals to go do other things at times? But how do you manage that part of it?
Well, certainly there is assistance available when someone needs it in the FBI. That is made available. I think everybody had their own ways of coping with things. I think you have to be adept at compartmentalizing and trying not to get too involved emotionally. You will always have those moments where something hits you and it makes you sad. Like, but you have to tune it out. You have a job to do. I think I equate it to somebody working in an emergency room, the things they have to see, or a doctor. They're just certain jobs where you have to detach. You have to just focus on the task at hand and not think about sometimes the human element, the emotions that come in. Now, for me, my coping mechanism, certainly I have a strong support system at home. And then I also love to run. And when I run, it's very therapeutic for me. It clears my head. I think during that time, sometimes I think a lot about work and maybe not so, but I just clear my mind. It makes me feel really good. And that has always been my therapy. And even when we were at the BAU, Susan, who's on my show, Susan Kostler-Drew, we would go for a run every morning before work. And that was therapy for us. And sometimes we would talk about work and sometimes we would talk about things completely unrelated to work, but it was very good. And that's what kept us emotionally grounded, I think.
And so it sounds like find something, whatever.
You have to find something. And I don't think that might not work for everybody. And, some people decide it's not the right job for them, whatever job they're doing, it's not right for them. It could be too difficult. Now, since I've done the podcast, I have more contact with family members. At BAU, you're somewhat insulated because, as I said, you're not the investigator. So it's the investigators who are talking to the family members, who are providing support to victims. It's not us. So we have that buffer. As a podcaster now, because of some of the cases that I do cover, I will have contact with victim families. And that can be hard because I feel their sadness. I talk with them about that, and it makes it a little more challenging, but it's very rewarding as well when they're grateful that you're covering their loved one's case. I find that very rewarding. And
yeah, there
whatever
really
I can do to help.
Yeah. And one of the nice things too on those lesser known cases, you might not have people who are able to get the support of the BAU. You guys are actually able to give them a decent consult or profile. So I want to throw out there, if anybody has an interesting case that's unsolved or even a solved case that we could learn something from, reach out to the folks at the consult. I'm going to turn it over to some of the people in the room to see if there are any questions. Brian, if you want to ask one, I'm going to give you the front order because he is from the Find Jody group. I'll bring you the mic. Here you go.
Hey, Julia, it's Brian.
Hi, Brian. How are you? I think I know you already.
Yeah, I chatted with you before a couple times.
We have, yeah.
So I support Find Jody. I'm not with them yet. I work at, in Rochester, Minnesota. So I was chatting with Caroline Lowe, and she had a question. Basically, are there any suggestions for the milestone anniversary in terms of getting the killer to respond? If they're still alive, like what would you suggest?
What I would suggest, not necessarily getting the killer to respond, but again, making a plea to someone who may know the killer and reminding them that not only is findjody.com not giving up, local law enforcement is not giving up. And that's what I would focus on, just keeping it in the spotlight. You never know. What I want to say is that just recently I was looking at a headline in my local news and I saw double homicide from, I think it was 1978, just recently solved. And it was solved because somebody, I don't have all the details of who it was, but they called in a tip They just called in the guy's name after all these years. I don't know how they knew the information, but they knew. So you just never know. And it's important to continue, especially in Jody's case, because as Caroline has reiterated, that many people think the case is solved. And so just continuing to highlight that it's not solved. All they need is a tip. All they need is a name. I'm not certain at this point an offender is going to come forward unless perhaps they're on their deathbed and they want to clear their conscience before they meet their maker.
I was going to ask another question about, I've done some recent interviews with victims' family members, and, Gabby Petito's parents came on, and they care deeply about things like education and awareness around domestic violence and cases of marginalized victims. And I think, thinking about the BAU and, your ability to sort of analyze and say something like in Jody's case, that this may be somebody who is stalking her or wasn't necessarily in her immediate friend circle, I guess. Do you think that there are things that we can learn about safety or other, thinking about domestic violence as one? I imagine in your analysis, you guys are looking at, is it likely to come from this or is it likely to come from that? That we can learn through listening to or reading more about behavioral analysis or listening to the podcast?
Well, I do think we have every now and then these little nuggets of information that people can take in and say, okay, I'm going to remember that. I'm going to remember that as a warning sign. But the one thing, I know I've said it on my podcast, I know I've said it at other times, but I think one of the most important things to remember is that particularly in cases of domestic violence early on, or somebody who gets involved in an abusive type of relationship, but early on, there will be signs. And I tell people, if somebody makes you feel bad for your feelings, that is the biggest red flag. You'll see it early on. For example, I always use this example. Somebody asks another person for a date. That person says, no, I don't really want to go. And then the person that's asked for the date makes a sarcastic comment, oh, am I not good enough for you? And then the person gives in, something like that. Instead of just saying, yes, I understand. And I know that just seems like very simplistic, but it's something I remind people all the time. If somebody makes you feel uncomfortable for your feelings, that is a red flag. Don't let them, everyone has boundaries. Some people's boundaries are set further back than others. And if somebody doesn't respect whatever your boundaries are, then that person is very likely to continue to push those boundaries in some way, shape, or form. And there's likely to be either emotional, physical, or sexual abuse in the long run.
And I think we kind of need those little tips with something like domestic violence, because by the time you're on the coercive control train, it's already blinding you from what's going on. Any other questions from the group? I can bring you a mic if it's on.
I just had a question on like advice you would give somebody that, like, if you recognize like a friend or a family member is like going through like a domestic violence situation, how to best help them.
Well, I would always say sit and talk with them. It's very difficult when somebody is afraid to get out of a relationship, but talk with them, make sure they have the resources available to them, make sure they know they would have support if they did decide to leave that relationship. Now, I'm not a domestic violence expert, so I would defer to somebody like that. Particularly if I had a friend, I would probably call someone that was an expert in that field and get advice about that. But I think just making sure that they know that there's help available. It is a very dangerous time. We've seen this in so many cases. When there is a relationship ending, it is the riskiest time in any relationship. And so many of the murders that we see, and many that remain unsolved, or many that remained debated. But when you look at the victim, they were in the process of trying to leave a relationship. It's very dangerous. And so it's easy enough to say you have help, or, here's where you can go. But I think you also have to have a good plan in place to keep that person safe. And they need to know that. They need to know that plan so that they know they can be safe if they leave that relationship.
Yeah, I kind of think about it like, so when I stopped drinking, the way that I ultimately stopped drinking was I had a friend that I had met like a year and a half before. She's like subtly let me know she was sober. And then she would hang out with me everywhere, including if I went to a bar, and she would never say anything. And what the message she subtly sent to me was, when it's time, you have an avenue out. And I think it's just so important for people to not feel like they're being judged, not feel like as someone's trying to isolate them, that they're being further pushed away and that they have a door. So do you guys have any other questions?
Related to that, but Julia, I was wondering if you had any thoughts to share about the shooter and the recent UnitedHealthcare CEO shooting, because there's been a lot of speculation, I feel like, and everybody's trying to profile him.
Yeah, I know Jayson and I have been communicating about this case. I don't know. I've seen what's in the media. I've tried to keep up with the updates. I think certainly victimology has to be developed in his case. I don't know that we know enough, but I know for a fact, just based on what I've read, colleagues, family, close friends, and associates are all being interviewed, because they really need to focus on where his risk was. Obviously, being a CEO of healthcare insurance company, that puts him at risk. It's high profile. Certainly, there may be people that would have problems, but we also need to know. When I say we, investigators need to examine his personal life. Did he have any enemies there, any arguments with people, those types of things? And then also trying to determine who's going to benefit from his death. There's so much to explore with that. I mean, just my general thoughts based on what's been reported. It's very well planned out, well thought out. Somebody didn't just decide to do this. This was a long-term plan in place. So those are just my general thoughts without knowing any. I don't have any inside information, and I've just seen what everybody else has seen. But I'll tell you, keep refreshing the news like every hour to see the progress. I think a lot of people are fixated in wanting to understand what happened.
Thank you.
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting about this case, I remember right as it broke, one of my reporters friends sent me a list. He's like, these are the 3 reasons, right? 3 potential reasons. And it's funny how similar reporting is to profiling. His list was, okay, disgruntled, somebody disgruntled from his personal life, an employee who had been fired, and somebody who had been harmed by the health insurance company. And Julia, the first thing he said to me was, we need to find out what's going on in this guy's personal life first before we start narrowing it on. And he did the kind of list I would imagine in your that you guys would do. But it begged a question for me. If in a case like that, where somebody's high risk because of their job or something like that, and if you guys found out that also there was a high risk personal life situation, like an affair or something along those lines, or some domestic problems, how do you go about narrowing it down to which one of the risks? Because I'm thinking about, you guys did the case of, what was his name? Bo
Bedford.
Yeah, Bedford. That
Yeah.
was in Alabama. Do I have that right?
Alabama. Yeah, very high risk victim.
Yeah, it was like the Chinese menu of risk. So how do you narrow it down as a profile?
I mean, you have to just assess everything and see where the biggest risk came from. And what we don't know about the CEO shooting, we don't really know much about his personal life. And we don't need to know. Obviously, investigators need to, look into that. And then then you take that and you overlay the investigation onto the risk level. I mean, they have to look at every single angle, and let's just say they look at it, he's got something very high risk in his personal life, and they're like, this is a big red flag. Well, you still have to rule out all the other potential risks that he might have, and then of course the investigative steps will hopefully lead to the perpetrator, and then we'll have the answers to, okay, why did this happen? But he may have multiple areas of risk in his life at this point, but we just don't know what those are.
Yeah. And one of the neat things, I think a great example of how you guys use statistics and other things like that to measure risk was the recent coverage you guys did on the JonBenet Ramsey case. I was surprised because Bob Drew, your partner, I went into that sort of second episode thinking, where you guys were doing the analysis, but not only did he throw out the statistics, but he was talking about the exceptions to the rule. How do you guys get your statistics and data on, are these things that the FBI collects, or you guys do it yourselves as profilers?
Well, some of it is just what other people have collected, other research that's been done. I mean, looking at, as you know, JonBenet's case, we looked at studies that had been done on pedophiles who murdered, and also looking at just the demographics in Boulder at the time. And so all that goes into, and again, this is all based on probabilities. And, so the thing that we discuss, as in our coverage of JonBenet, is that yes, most children who are at the greatest risk of violence and danger in their own home, if a child ends up murdered in their own home, it is likely someone in their home. But then when you start looking at, okay, you have a sexual assault aspect, that starts changing a little bit what you're looking at. You're not looking at a typical abuse situation that you see in other cases. You're looking at something slightly different. So that's how we have approached it. Now, I want to kind of backtrack because when we look at, and this kind of goes back to what you're also asking, when we look at Jodi Huisentruit's case and trying to look at her risk level, it's sort of similar to looking at Brian Thompson's murder in that, he's high profile. He's got a high profile job. And in looking at Jodi, she had a high profile job. We also examined her personal life. And what we just found was that there wasn't a lot of risk in her personal life or in her interpersonal relationships that we saw. And so we felt that she's at a higher risk in her professional life. And that may be what investigators determine. They go back into Mr. Thompson's personal life and his acquaintance, and they find that we just don't really see anything there. So this is more likely related to his position as a CEO. So that it's sort of similar in that way, just sort of seeing what risks are there. Can we identify anything like that? So
yeah, no, that makes sense. So since we're going to wrap up, I was going to give you a chance to have some closing thoughts. You recently did an episode with my friend, Brett Talley from the Prosecutors Podcast, on true crime ethics too. And, I have done, I don't know, maybe almost half a dozen episodes on that, from the Delphi case to more broad topics. I've listened to a ton, and I found it to be one of the most powerful episodes, in part because you tackled this concept of the importance of truth, whatever that truth may be, even if that truth runs against you. So that's my secret way of planting an idea. So I wanted to go ahead and give you a chance to close.
Well, in that episode with Brett was important for me to do. As you know, I struggle sometimes with some of the cases that we've covered because what I don't want to do is hurt anybody worse. Or, I want to help bring closure, so to speak. I want to help families heal, and I want them to get answers, and I want to be part of the solution. And what I don't want to do is harm anything, whether it's harm an investigation, hurt a victim, hurt a victim's family. And some of what I see in true crime or true crime coverage is there are some creators that are hurting people, and they're maybe undermining our faith, as Brett pointed out, in the justice system. What I don't want to do, obviously, we're human, we're imperfect. There may be times where we do that, but I think just continuing to talk about it, trying to figure out how can we be better at what we do by still accomplishing what we want to accomplish, and doing it in a accurate and truthful manner.
In my
and I know that's easier said than done. That is just idealistic. But I think, as Brett pointed out, if we make that our mission to be victim centric with whatever case we're covering, then that's the first step in being as ethical as possible.
Right. And one of the neat things for me this year in interviewing the loved ones of victims, and whether this was Bruce Maitland, who's the father of Breonna Maitland, who was a 17-year-old who disappeared in Vermont in 2004, or Maura Murray's big sister, Julie, and Maura also disappeared in New Hampshire in 2004. It was about a month apart. But they both said something to me when I asked them questions that sort of surprised me. And Julie probably said it more firmly. She said, people have a misperception that I'm trying to censor what's said about Maura. And whether it's bad or good, I want to know it if it will help solve the case. And it doesn't matter. And to me, that was something, it was sort of a powerful clarion call to look at victims advocacy slightly different, and that it's really about truth, and that truth is what these loved ones want. Well, thank you, Julia. I really appreciate it.
You.
We've got Jim Schmidt from the Gabby Petito Foundation on next. Hopefully you'll get a chance to hang out in the chat and ask us some more questions.
Very much.
All right.
I
Thank you,
appreciate
Julia.
it. Take care.
I'm Jayson Blair, and this is a Silver Linings Handbook podcast bonus episode. We'll see you all again soon.